Everybody, welcome back to Bookenstein. I'm Brooks. I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm here with Peyton Jones. And Bookenstein, basically, we just mine all kind of different books for their spiritual truths. And today we're talking about both of our favorite books, The Hobbit. I think Peyton's a little more of a Hobbit fan than me. We both got our copies of The Hobbit behind us, but Peyton's got a really fancy copy of The Hobbit.
I do.
And you got a fancy copy of Bilbo's contract behind you, which I do
I do
not.
have a facsimile hanging up in that odd kind of box right there. I have a facsimile of the movie contract done by the same calligrapher who did it. That was my reward for writing a textbook a few years ago in finishing. And then a buddy of mine who's a woodworker actually built that case. You don't care about all this, but I really want to tell you about it. So that's important to me. And now I've pretty much vomited it all over you. So, but yeah, I mean, The Hobbit to me, if we just jump right in, The Hobbit to me is a book about reluctant heroes. And I have felt like this in ministry my entire life. I did not want to be in ministry. I was literally asked to go into ministry to keep the seat warm for my youth pastor. I was 19 years old. His wife was suffering from mental illness. I am still very tight with both of them, love them to death. But when the pastor came and asked me, hey, just maybe 6 weeks to maybe 6 months at max. And I said, I have to pray about it. I don't know if I'm willing to do that. I was in nursing school. I was becoming an RN. I thought I would go share the love of Jesus with people from the LGBTQ community. We didn't call it back then. We just said gay people. And I thought, man, if there's anyone who needs to know that Jesus loves them, it would be that population. So I went in. I guess in a weird way, I still was going to minister. It didn't matter whether or not I was, quote unquote, a minister or not. I just thought I'm going to go to the people that need Jesus and don't know how much he loves them. And I'll go there. So when I was doing that, this is when this came halfway through nursing school. Now, nursing school is tough without that. But I said yes. He said, you have till Sunday. This was on a Friday. You have till Sunday to tell me. So I prayed fast and I ended up in ministry, and my entire relationship with ministry has been much like Bilbo Baggins on the adventure. There's a love-hate the entire time throughout this book. And I find, Brooks, it's kind of like a principle in anything in life, that there's this love-hate relationship with anything of value. You don't want to do certain things, but even like your character development. Dallas Willard used to say that your character doesn't truly develop until you start doing things you don't want to do.
Yeah. You talking about your story as a youth pastor. I have a kind of a similar experience where our youth pastor went to go plant a church, and we had like a leadership team in place. And our executive pastor comes into a meeting with us, and he's like, hey, I've been praying about this. And he's like, I'd really like for Brooks to be the kind of the liaison between your team and the staff. And I was like, okay. I was like, this is really weird. Like, I don't know why you need to pray about just communicating back and forth. But then I found out that they were hands off and they were just letting us lead. And I was like, I ended up accidentally leading the student ministry until they found a new youth pastor. And that's kind of what ministry always is somebody like, for Bilbo, it was Gandalf coming in and saying, hey, I see this in you, and I want you to go and go on this adventure. That's kind of what a lot of ministry is. It's just, hey, will you step in and do this? And I know you're not equipped yet, but you're going to figure it out as you go.
Yeah, and I mean that was Jesus with the 12, right? He, to prep them for mission, he takes them on mission, and then makes them do things like heal and cast out demons, and even the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000, he has them do the miracle. I mean, it's obviously not their power, but they're breaking off the bread and the miracle's happening in their hands. And Bilbo starts finding himself despite himself the entire journey. He's afraid. And I love how there's those two, kind of like all of us, right? There's flesh and spirit. The flesh part of us craves comfort. It wants, routine. And the spirit part is the adventurous cycle in our life. And this is why the Celts used to call the Holy Spirit the wild goose, because they saw the Holy Spirit as wild, kind of like Jesus said, he's like the wind. He's untamable. You don't know where he's come from or where he's going. And Gandalf sneaks up on Bilbo, and I find that often that's the game that the Holy Spirit's playing with me, is kind of this veritable hide and seek where he's, hey, I see you hiding over there in your hobbit hole. In fact, my office looks like a hobbit hole, and it's a constant reminder to me to get out there on mission. And when I don't, I start to feel those two sides of Bilbo Baggins. In fact, it's funny because the way that Tolkien writes this book, he actually talks about the Took side of Bilbo, because he's Bilbo Baggins, and the Baggins side is the part that loves the Shire and his pipe and his blocks of cheese and his warm bread and his his comfort and kicking his feet up, and he keeps talking about his armchair and a good book. I so relate to that, right? I have a Baggins side. But then he says the Took side of him. He has this ancestor who's a Took, and the Tooks were known as troublemakers and adventurers and wanderers. And so in the book, it's funny, at the very end of the book, Tolkien makes a statement that as Bilbo's making his way back to the Shire, it says, the Took part of him was very tired by this time, and the Baggins was waxing stronger. And so if you think about, us in ministry, right, there are times where it's Took all the way for me. It's frontier, it's mission. Then there's other times it's like, yeah, the Baggins, like I'm in a Baggins phase right now, but I'm planting, and the Took is starting to wax, and the Baggins is starting to wane.
Yeah. And you find that a lot with Tolkien's writing, is there's always a dichotomy. There's two things all the time. Like he in particular, he's always juxtaposing moral choices against each other, which is different than a lot of things you see on like TV or in movies now that's popular. Things like Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, Ozark. You have these like descent into darkness slowly, or even some of the new Star Wars shows where you have like Andor and Mandalorian, where you have the Empire's characters, the evil side, but you relate to and you like and you feel sympathetic towards, and you don't like some of the what are supposed to be the good guys. But for Tolkien, you always have this really clear good versus evil, and it doesn't mean that the character is going to choose the right thing. There's always an internal conflict between making the right decision, but there's always a clear right decision. And I think that's what we can kind of get into is, when you, as a Christian, you're looking at, there's always a right and wrong decision when you're following Jesus. And that doesn't mean it's not a hard decision to make, but there's always that clear right and wrong. Yeah. And I think that comes out a lot in Tolkien's writing.
I agree. And I think a lot of that is because Tolkien was such a lover of heroism that he got from Anglo-Saxon and Nordic mythology. Now he was a linguist, and Lewis, who they met at something called the Coalbiters Society, which before they formed the Mythopoeic Society, which is where they would read each other's works to one another, like The Hobbit. They read that there to one another. They read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. But before that, they were in the coal biters, and that was a celebration of all things Norse. And if you go into like Nordic mythology and even culture, the greatest achievement was to die in battle, right? To die doing scary things, to die doing hard things.
Mhm.
And heroism to Tolkien is this ideal that you see in his. And so when you're talking about the right and wrong, good and evil, the heroism that he elevates is that sacrificing of yourself, dying to self, doing something for the common good. And like in The Hobbit, right, you have characters that are out for themselves, and then you have like the in the town of Dale, right, you have the
Mhm.
mayor in that town who's very selfish and he's out for himself, and he ends up wandering the moors at the end of the story, driven mad by greed for gold. Whereas, Bilbo and others are like, hey, you can have, if this will stop the war, I will give all of my share to, you can have it, right? And there's this constant sense in which the elevating of heroism is the ideal. And that means that and this goes back to what we're saying, you do hard things. You do things that you don't want to do. And it's character. It's not wealth. It's not reputation. It is that idea of heroism. And this is where I think Tolkien's so powerful, because like you said, they may not always do the right thing or want to. That conflict for Bilbo is always that he doesn't want to be a hero,
Yeah.
but put in the situation, he finds himself doing things that even shock himself. And I
Yeah.
think all of us feel that in ministry when we get in. It's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up that Tolkien was a linguist, because to me, Tolkien's use of language in The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings is maybe the most brilliant thing that he does, because he actually, the way he creates the whole world is he creates the languages first.
Yes.
Then he creates the histories and stories, and then characters emerged out of that, because language is the way we see the world. We actually, like, we use language in order to describe it. Like, language informs the way we're able to think. And one of the things that I think about is we have a mutual friend, Brian McLemore from Bible League International. I
Yes.
remember him talking about the challenges of translating the Bible into other languages. And he talked about how they were translating into Thai. And he was like, there's a word for younger brother and there's a word for older brother, but there's no word in Thai for just brother. And so when you're translating things like brothers and sisters in Christ, to us, that's an equalizing term. But you can't even translate that, it does not translate into Thai. And so Tolkien's creating these languages, and you have these different languages, these different backstories, and that shapes how you have the dwarves and elves and hobbits, and they approach the world differently.
Yeah.
And you even see it when he starts writing songs. There's all kinds of songs and poetry in The Hobbit, which is unlike maybe any other work of fiction. And they're
Yeah.
really good, like they're really technically very high quality poems. And
Yeah.
like at first I was reading those and I'm like, man, these are kind of a distraction to the story, but they inform the story. And they're actually like we're obsessed with music as humans. We 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 sing in church, we go to pay money to go to concerts to sing, we sing at sporting events, we sing in the shower, and we sing all the time for all kinds of reasons, right? And so Tolkien embeds that into his narratives. And you actually begin to see when somebody is singing, like an elf
Mm-hmm.
is singing, it's very different than
Yes.
if anyone else is singing. And you start to see the way that they view the world through those songs.
Oh, so good. Like when you're saying that, I'm getting excited because yes, the old cartoon. Now you're gonna laugh because I have a poster, a 1970s watercolor of Lord of the Rings up here, but they made an old 1970s Rankin and Bass. So or is it no? Sorry, Bass and Rankin. The Rudolph claymation series. Those guys made a cartoon of the Hobbit. And when I was a kid, this was the bee's knees. I had the little flip book with the tape where it does a little chime and then you turn it. And I remember in there, in the movie at least, they had put those songs to music. And because, like you said, they were so well crafted, it was very easy to do because they did lend themselves to, because they were just composed so well, you could actually sing them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've seen the modern Peter Jackson film, you get chills when they start singing that very somber, and he describes it as almost like putting him in a trance. And he says he
Yeah.
doesn't know if it was a smoke that filled the room or the beer or what it was, but he falls asleep to this like mystical, longing song that they sing about their home that they're going back to.
Mm-hmm.
The Oh, okay, and it's time for confession here. This is the Lonely Mountain, and that is Smaug. If that tells you anything about my love for this book, but yeah. And then the elves, like the way he portrays, as you said, not just the character, their way of speaking. The elves are very graceful, almost not of this world, which he brings out a little bit more in Lord of the Rings. The hobbits are simple. We have a joke in Wales that they're the Welsh. But then you've got men who are, much like the Nordics. And then you've got the dwarves that are, they're definitely Northerners up in England, blue collar working class. That's what they are. So it's interesting. I would say that the elves are like the south of England, a little more refined, the north and the south of England. One's blue collar, one's white collar. Well, okay. So what are some of the highlights of the book? Like what were some of your favorite parts of reading The Hobbit?
So here's one of the themes that sticks out to me that I love is that when you have this journey that Hobbit that Bilbo and the dwarves are on, right? And they don't really like each other at first. They're always undermining each other and pointing fingers at each other. And gradually over time, their fellowship is forged through experiences. And so like Bilbo will rescue the dwarves from spiders and elves. And after he has a meal with them and he sings with them, he agrees to go on a journey with it. Like there's these experiences, there's these moments that bring people together. And I feel like that's exactly the way everything works in the real world. You can't just throw people together and that's how it works with like my small group, right? Because we're during the middle of summer, we just moved some people up that have graduated at a higher grade, right? Because I'm discipling teenagers. And so not everybody knows each other. They don't want to share in group. We've got a couple kids that are autistic and they can't kind of understand and relate to everyone the same way. So it's really difficult in the middle of a small group to get anybody to share about anything deep. But then I'll go hang out with them. Like they all play pickleball. So we'll go 8 o'clock at night, 8 to 10, we'll play pickleball. Then we'll go to McDonald's afterwards. And then they just start talking about all kinds of stuff they won't talk about in group. But you have to be around people. It's like Jesus when he's in the boat and there's a storm and they wake Jesus up. They're like, Jesus, don't you care about us? And he uses that moment, like he's just with them. He's not like looking to preach a sermon or anything, but he's just hanging around them and he fixes whatever's going on in their lives. And then he teaches them, have you no faith? Right. And so that's Tolkien uses that through all of his books. So that's kind of one of the big things that sticks out to me when I'm reading The Hobbit.
Here's the deal, right? Like you talked about like the environment, right? Like the storm with the Tolkien very much uses his environment. And you said like that was one of the things that he's known for. And I agree, like the amount of art by like John Howe, Alan Lee, the stuff that's come out that's inspired artists. I mean, so much of that movie was taken from John Howe and Alan Lee art. But he there's a continuity amongst artists because he doesn't just describe the environment, he really world builds. And I
Hmm.
think Tolkien was the first modern fantasy, or in that whole realm of the imagination, to truly world build. Because when you read C.S. Lewis, you don't get that. You
Yeah.
don't get a description where when you read it you actually feel like you're right there. Like I can feel the mist, I can feel if they're talking about walking out under the starlight and the cold and the way the trees are bent over, you just feel you're there. Your
Yeah.
imagination automatically. He describes the leaves falling in the autumn. There's so many things that scene where the thrush is knocking the snail against the door, the way he describes the sunset as the sun is setting, to me is so powerful. I feel like I can see that when I'm reading that. So,
Yeah.
um,
I hear
but
the thrush all the time because my ice maker sounds like that.
oh, does it really? How funny!
That's the
How
image I
funny!
have every time I hear my ice maker.
Do you go looking for the keyhole before it vanishes?
Yeah.
You have this innate panic in the back of your mind. But Tolkien, really, you could say that the environment is actually one of the characters. It is an ever, wherever you're at with Tolkien, wherever you're at in that world, Mirkwood Forest, the oppression that's in there. When he breaks up through the trees and he sees the sunlight, and it's like being underwater and coming up for air. The way he describes that, and then the view, and then the butterflies and the trees and all of that's so powerful, right? So I think when you're reading Tolkien, it's just a treat. There are a few books where I think you can just slow down and read and appreciate someone at the height of his craft. And that brings us to, I think, one of the things about The Hobbit people don't like is that it's often thought of as a book for children.
Mm.
And even in a way, like C.S. Lewis kind of, who this is ironic, C.S. Lewis wrote his line The Witch and the Wardrobe. They didn't really like each other's children's books. Lewis always praised Tolkien, but felt his other book was better. To me, there's just something I resonate, I would say, more with in this book. I feel that the 3-volume Lord of the Rings is fantastic and a masterpiece all the same, but it was so ambitious, and it's this epic. I mean, it is
Mhm.
truly an epic. I mean, this is an epic, but it's not an epic work in
Yeah.
proportion, right? In length, it is a bite-sized epic, and it is almost kind of like a fable, but there's so much richness in the story, like Gollum, the riddles in the dark, where they're doing the riddles. As a kid, I was in awe of the riddles that they told each other, like the one about, it has no key, hinge, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. As a kid, and he says, oh, eggs, Gollum guesses that it's eggs. That to me was just brilliant. I mean, I had never encountered that kind of wit before. And
Yeah.
so yeah, there's just so much packed in there. There's a lot of intelligent things. There's a lot of very epic things in there. But I kind of believe we ought to read children's books as adults. I think we have a
Yeah.
lot to learn from that.
Yeah. And it's funny because The Hobbit, it feels a little more like Swiss Family Robinson. It's this warm, fuzzy kind of story.
Yes,
Whereas The Lord of the Rings, you almost can't believe it's by the same person.
right.
It's much more serious and dark and bleak, and um, even though it has the same characters in it.
Yeah. I think it's funny because like when I picture like Lord of the Rings, it's like Britain in the winter, right? There's only a few hours of sunlight. Everything's dark. But The Hobbit is like Britain in the summer, right? When there's beer gardens and everybody's sitting out by the river, enjoying a pint and all the stuff with like Hobbiton. That's Britain in the summer. I mean, it's everybody's out gardening, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, the Hobbit feels like summer to me, and the Lord of the Rings feels like winter. They have very different, or you could even say like night and day. I don't really know what if Lord of the Rings existed without the Hobbit. I think we'd be much poorer.
Yeah.
I think it's but a lot of people don't like it. They just say, "Oh, just give me Lord of the Rings. I won't waste my time with it." But I do think the reluctant hero. One of the things, a couple things that I'll say about some of the import of it is there's a line where Bilbo at the very beginning says, "Oh, adventures, terrible things, make you late for supper." And Gandalf is really pushing, and I think God does that. He pushes us out into adventures we don't want to go in. And Bilbo says, when he's starting to turn it over in his mind, if he wants to go, he says, "Can you guarantee that I'll return?" And Gandalf, and this is one of those, I believe, quotes. It's on the level of Lewis's, "Is Aslan safe?" Safe, heavens, no. He's a lion, but he is good.
Yeah.
That's one of those, like, you frame it, you put it on your wall. This one where Bilbo says, "Can you guarantee that I'll return, I'll come back?" And Gandalf says, "No, I can't guarantee that, but I can guarantee that if you do return, you'll come back different and changed." And I think that is such, again, that's to me a frameable concept and quote, because that is the promise that Jesus makes to all of us. I can't guarantee your safety. I can't guarantee that the Baggins part of you is going to be happy with all this, but I can guarantee you'll be different. And at the very end, it's very interesting. Reading this years later, I have not read this for like 20 something years. Coming back to it and reading it again and seeing that scene where Gandalf actually looks and is taken back by Bilbo and says, "Well, you are a very different hobbit now, after all, Mr. Bat." Like, he tells him, and there's even a scene where the providence of God is all throughout the book. So there is a sense in which Tolkien gives a nod to the fact that there have been divine ends guiding him the whole time. And at the very end, he says, "Oh, you don't say that you just," because Bilbo's saying, "Well, I don't know if all that prophecy stuff was really a part of this." And Gandalf says, "Do you really mean to tell me, Mr. Baggins, that you doubt the prophecy simply because you may have played a part in them?" And I just find that so powerful, right? Because we underestimate ourselves so much and God's providence, maybe God's plan that involves us, because we know us, right? But this journey of transformation that Bilbo's on, I believe, has the zenith. And this will kind of be my final contribution to the conversation, I think. But one of my favorite scenes is where Bilbo, who has doubted himself, you've got the wrong guy, he's mumbling and grumbling to himself on the whole journey. "I'm not a burglar. I don't know why Gandalf told him I can't, I've never burgled anything." But later on, when Smaug, which is the climax really of the story, Smaug asks him, "I can smell you, and I can tell you're not dwarf. Who are you, deceiver?" And he says, "I am the one who comes from under the mountain. I am," and he goes into this like a litany of titles that he's acquired, and they're self-made titles, but he recounts all of the journey of his transformation through all these. "I am he who is dead and alive again. I am the barrel rider, the ring finder, he who walks in the darkness." All of these awesome titles that he adds to himself, instead of just, "I'm Bilbo Baggins. a bag end. You know, he becomes this other thing. And when I look at Jesus, when he says, when he meets Peter, men call you Simon, but I tell you, you are the rock. You are Peter. And even in Revelation, where he says, to he who overcomes, I will write on him a new name, which no man knows. Right? It's personal. Like, I know who I've made you. I know who you are. I know the little dance we've been doing. It's a bit like Gandalf. I know your name. I know who you really are. You don't know yet, but I know who you are. That's powerful to me.
Yeah. That's probably the best way to end this.
Well, I mean, you can't shut me up about the Hobbit. So such a cool book. And thanks for indulging me. We'll be back for another book. We're going to cover one of Brooks's picks next. So that should be fun. We'll do that. And then we're going to have on this show something we didn't mention in the introduction. We will also, from time to time, be able to interview some authors about the works. Obviously, we cannot interview Tolkien, but you can find a response of Tolkien. When people ask him about the Lord of the Rings, I have to mention this before we go, Brooks. There's a famous clip where there's how it should have ended. If you've ever seen that YouTube show, where they say, why didn't the Eagles just ride Frodo over top of Mount Doom and drop the ring into the volcano? Done. No journey, no 3 novels. And there's a famous clip of Tolkien addressing this. And he says, to those who ask me, why did he not simply go on the back of the Eagles and handle this quickly, without all the hullabaloo? And to them, I would like to say, shut up. That's how cool Tolkien was. So anyways, guys, thanks for joining us today on really our maiden voyage, besides our introduction. This is like chapter 1, right, of Bookenstein. And be sure to read The Hobbit. It is one of those books that will reward you simply by the mastery of Tolkien in his craft. It's one of those books that you savor like a good wine. You don't gulp it down to empty the cup. You just enjoy the journey. Thanks for joining us today on this journey. We'll see you next time on Bookenstein.